Okay, so I want to welcome you all to the reInvent the PhD retreat. Right? And I want to thank everyone for coming. I know it is a schlep for many of you. Finding the building itself is kind of hard, so I really appreciate it. And it's just really exciting to finally see everybody here together after the couple of months of planning that we've had. And we're also all really looking forward to tomorrow. So I hope as many of you as possible can stay through tomorrow. So I'm Catherine Temple, and I'm lucky enough to be the director of the Connected Academics Project at Georgetown. And I'm just going to say a few words about the genesis of the project and thank a few people, and then I'm going to turn things over to my colleague, Ricardo Ortiz, and he's going to introduce our speakers. So first, the genesis or the evolution of the project. This is part of a much larger national effort to rethink humanities PhD programs as we also rethink the value of the humanities in the larger world. While one of the goals here is to suggest a broad slate of both academic and extra academic employment for PhDs in the humanities, another goal is, frankly, subversion. If you're joining us, you might believe, as I do, that humanities advocates can change the world, and that we need them out there in the real world creating change just as much as we need them in the academy. So for all the focus here on the practicalities of the degree and the job market, you might, like me, also hold more lofty goals, right? To make the humanities central to solving global issues and concerns. So this project is young. We already have so many people to thank. It does take a village, as you can see from the setup today. First, the Mellon Foundation and the MLA who are funding this effort. Without Mellon and Rosemary Field, David Lawrence, and Steve Olson of the MLA, we wouldn't be here today. Secondly, the Graduate School at Georgetown, who has kindly hosted our project and given me an office. It's a very nice office. I also want to thank our speakers, our faculty leaders, and graduate students. They are here because they're curious, broad thinkers, and because they want to advance the humanities, and because they care about the role they play in our collective future. Finally, without Erin Hanlon, now at Colby College, Sam Hulley, a senior here in the college, and Maria Snyder, who I like to refer to as our grants guru, none of us would be here now. I also want to thank Torsten Manga, who's joining our team from the philosophy department. See him right over here. So without further ado, I will turn this over to my colleague, Ricardo Ortiz, the chair of English, and he was one of the early thought leaders that led to this moment. So I'm really glad to have him here tonight. He too deserves our thanks, and he will introduce our speakers.
Thank you, Catherine. You can hear me? Welcome everyone. I couldn't be more thrilled and more grateful to be here, and I also just want to extend an enormous amount of thanks to Catherine Temple for her extraordinary and irreplaceable leadership in all of this that we're doing now. We wouldn't be here without her. So I have the pleasure and the honor to introduce our four panelists, and I get to begin with someone that I can both introduce and welcome back to Georgetown, our former Dean of our College of Arts and Sciences, Jane McAuliffe. Jane McAuliffe is the Director of National and International Outreach, a new service unit of the Library of Congress, and President Emeritus of Bryn Mawr College. She held former positions as Director of the Library of Congress's Kluge Library, Dean of Georgetown College, and Professor and Chair of the Department for the Study of Religion at the University of Toronto, where she received her PhD in Islamic Studies. A specialist and renowned expert in the Quran, she is editor of the 6-volume Encyclopedia of the Quran and has served on the Vatican's Commission for Religious Relations. Peter Brooks is Sterling Professor Emeritus of Comparative Literature at Yale University and the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation Scholar at Princeton University. At Princeton, he directs a project on the ethics of reading and the cultures of professionalism, which included the symposium, The Humanities in the Public Sphere, held at Princeton in April 2012, the source of his recent book, edited with Hilary Jewett, The Humanities and Public Life, Fordham 2014. He has authored or edited more than 20 books on topics including narrative and narrative theory, the 19th and 20th century novel, mainly French and English, and the interrelations of law and literature. Julie Maloney is currently a senior manager of software engineering at Hobson's, where she leads teams responsible for the design and delivery of Hobson's K-12 student advising platform. She began her career in technology in 1994, worked in Silicon Valley for over a decade, wrote several books about learning web technologies, and then decided to seek new and exciting opportunities in higher education. She got her MA in English from San Jose State in 2007, where I taught until 1996. All right, go Spartans. And her PhD in English from Washington State University, where I've never been, in 2010. Okay, all right. Specializing in 19th century American literature and history of the book. After her PhD, she was the chief architect of the online library environment at the University of Virginia, where her teams designed and developed a new interface and storage mechanism for the public access catalog system, and also developed UVA's institutional repository for publications, theses, and dissertations. She entered the private sector in 2012, and since then has held leadership and management positions for DC area companies focused on educational processes, workflows, and content delivery. She also happily provides technical consultation services for Mellon, NEH, ODH, and IMLS grant-funded projects. And finally, Katya Seljat. Okay. Since 2015, Katya has directed the Office of Challenge Grants at NEH, where she oversees an annual $8.5 million portfolio. Previously, she served as Vice President for Education at the National Building Museum. She was also Associate Director for the Stanford Humanities Center and head of the Getty Research Institute Scholars Program. Her career in museums includes work at the Harvard University Art Museums, the Lower East Side Tenement Museum, and the something in German Deutsches Historisches Museums in Berlin, which I think probably has something to do with German history. Katya received her BA from Yale University and her PhD in history from Harvard University, as well as Fulbright and Mellon Fellowships and a Harvard Teaching Award. She has taught graduate seminars at the University of Southern California, and while at Stanford, she was an instructor for the Hope House program, which brings humanities courses to women often recently released from prison and in recovery from drug and alcohol addiction. Her writings have appeared in the Journal of Visual Culture, the Journal of Urban History, and elsewhere. Please join me in welcoming all four of our panelists.
Can you hear me all right, or should I amplify? Okay, good. My remarks are grouped within a few categories. First of all, I want to speak a little bit about the perspectives with which I come to this conversation. Secondly, I'd like to mention a few people as a way of fleshing out some of the individuals who are the silent listeners to what we will discuss today. I'd then like to talk about placement, where our conversation is situated temporally and geographically. Fourthly, just mention a few programs that are relevant to this conference, and finally raise a few possibilities for discussion. That's 5 Ps. I worked hard on getting those 5 Ps in there. But just to speak a little bit about perspectives, I realized as I started to think about coming here today, and it really is so nice to be back on this campus. I can't tell you, it lifts my spirits every time I walk onto the hilltop. Of course, I bring initially the perspective of a former PhD student, one who did that work many, many years ago. After that, the perspective of a faculty member and then a department chair, and certainly one who was very involved in hiring committees at both public and private universities, where there was a lot of focus on two things: trying to attract stars to the department, but also trying to attract helpful colleagues who would take their share of the burdens of departmental work. Those, as I recall hiring committees in those days of being on the faculty and then being chair of the department, those were two primary goals, one stated and one perhaps not stated, but certainly there in our considerations. Then when I moved into the position of dean here at Georgetown, yes, we were looking as the College of Arts and Sciences for stars, for both emerging and current stars, but not just for research, but also those who would be attractive, compelling teachers in the classroom. And there was always a bit of tension in that because there was a lot of reputational oomph to be secured in pushing for the research productive stars. I recall a lot of concern about salary discrepancies among fields across the college, and that still exists. There are areas in which we had to compete far more aggressively and with pay scales that were out of whack as you think of the multitude of departments that make up the college. I was worried about gender imbalance in particular disciplines, a situation that continues in some ways to solve itself, but not completely. There remain areas within the humanities, sciences, and social sciences where there are significant gender imbalances in both the entry level as well as the more advanced levels of the professoriate. And then there was always the tension that a department would bring to a search of, wanting to hire somebody above the level at which the search was pitched, always striving, which was a good thing, always trying to get the very, very best person that could enhance the department's operations and reputation. When I moved into a presidency of a liberal arts college, again, the perspective shifted somewhat. There, the hiring and particularly the tenuring decisions became very relevant to building the college's profile long term. How are we going to create a faculty of note that would be attractive both in their ability to draw students to the particular disciplines of the college, but also, frankly, who would carry in their research and publications the banner of the college and be a significant instrument of the college's visibility. I was also very focused on the need to support faculty at various stages in their careers. And I think as at Bryn Mawr, as at many places, there was a lot of emphasis on mentoring those new faculty members whom we were hiring and rewarding those who we were making full professors. But there was a lot of compression in the middle ranks at the associate professor level, both in terms of salaries, but also, I think, in terms of expectations, where much of the load of carrying forth the committee and the service work of the college was borne, particularly in the middle ranks. I had the experience at Bryn Mawr of having to close a PhD program, and it was a painful thing, and I had to readjust several others. Bryn Mawr, although it's a liberal arts college and predominantly an undergraduate institution, had a long history of PhD programs, many of which were shuttered in the 80s, but some of which remained, some of national standing, but others had ceased to be truly competitive in both their ability to attract good PhD students as well as to place the students whom they graduated. So again, my perspective was shifting. I've been at the Library of Congress now since, well, just 1 year. I was hired at the Kluge Center, which is the Scholars Center at the Library of Congress, which will welcome Peter Brooks in January, and I'm delighted at that. And again, then I started looking at this whole conversation from a different lens, because while in those months that I was director of the Kluge Center, it was clear that it would be wonderful to be able to hire PhDs as staff in the center, to be program officers and to be able to assist the scholars, both senior and junior, whom the Kluge Center attracts, in settling themselves in and in fast-tracking their research projects. I mean, there were and there will continue to be. After a few months in that job, I was asked to set up a new division for the Library of Congress, which includes the Kluge Center, but also includes all of the public-facing programs of the Library of Congress. And there again, I began to see so many potential opportunities for people with real depth training, such as a PhD gives, but willing to use that training to make knowledge accessible to a broader public, because this new division, national and international outreach, includes the research enterprises, but also things like the visitor services, the exhibits, the National Book Festival, which attracts a huge number of people each year, the Gershwin Prize. I don't know if anybody's done a PhD on Willie Nelson, who will get the Gershwin Prize this year. But I mean, there are lots of areas in which I can see the value added that credential and those skills would bring to so many places within the library. So those are the perspectives that I offer in this conversation. But I did a little research. I did two things. I pulled together a focus group of some of our researchers at the Kluge Center, two of whom are here this afternoon. And these were doctoral and postdoctoral students, and because I wanted to get a kind of current sense of how people were thinking about the PhD education in which they were involved or had recently graduated from. And it was fascinating. Two were US PhD students, one was German and one was British, and the experiences differed markedly. Charlotte, who's with us here, noted that the PhD is not the final degree, at least for the academic world. In fact, I think, to quote her, and I know I put it down here, the PhD is not the beginning of an academic career, but the end of one's formal education. Lots of people in Germany who go on to be politicians or librarians, who run museums, etc., have PhDs. That the academic degree then is the second PhD, the Habilitationsschrift. So that's a different educational environment. The two U.S. doctorates had a sense of a shift having occurred, a significant shift having occurred since they got their degrees in 2006 and 2008, respectively. That the market had changed, that what they experience in the students whom they now nurture as PhD students is much more of a culture of fear and concern and anxiety about the future than they themselves faced at the time that they were in graduate school. Finally, our student, who was from the UK, noted some pretty interesting experiences that he was able to access as a PhD student in the UK in terms of being prepared to teach, opportunities to learn to teach, one of which was called the Brilliant Club. I'm sorry, I had to say that. Which is a national competition for PhD students who create mini modules and then teach them in lower income schools. I noted in doing some reading about this topic that the Graduate Center at the City University of New York has forged a similar program with LaGuardia Community College. So that was a little bit of focus group research. But I also then thought about some people with whom I have worked at various times in my own academic career, both as particularly in administration, who had PhDs but who took different paths than that. I won't, in this case, name names, but I'll sketch very briefly three of these people because I think their experiences may help to inform some of our conversations. One had a University of Chicago PhD in ethics and then went on to get a law degree. Never took a tenure track position, but now runs a major research and public policy center at a top-tier university, and also does teach quite regularly. But and the work that he did for his PhD very directly informs what he does in running this research center and, of course, his teaching. Another is a woman who did her degree at UPenn in the University of Pennsylvania in post-colonial literature. She did take a tenure track position initially at Ohio State. Left after 3 years for a reason I think that is increasingly common. She was in a commuter marriage. Her husband, a lawyer, stayed in Philadelphia. They had a young child, and it proved unsustainable. And so at the point that she moved back to Philadelphia, she initially went to work in the provost's office of a Philadelphia university, eventually was asked to run a major capital campaign, and now has a position as a senior administrator at a private liberal arts college. Work which she finds very, very fulfilling because it allows her to connect with all of the constituencies of this college. She's the secretary of the college, secretary of the board of trustees. The final example is a fellow who did his PhD in Renaissance Studies at Harvard, and now directs a fellowship program for senior scholars. When I called him about this and just had a conversation back and forth telling him about this meeting this afternoon, he opened up a little bit about his studies at Harvard, admitted that in that period he was not sure, almost from the beginning, that he wanted to go the classroom route or to move into other areas in which the background he had achieved would be useful but wouldn't be directly the tenure track position effort. So in order to facilitate keeping those options open as long as possible, he took a management course in the business school while a PhD student. And he said, but I wouldn't have dared to tell my advisor that. And that one comment said a lot to me. I'd like to step back as I think about place. I'd like to step back for a minute and acknowledge that we, in a sense, are in the minority. We are having this conversation at an elite university, and such places have been the training grounds, I think, of most of us. But in my years at Bryn Mawr, when I was also on the board of the American Council of Higher Education, I became much, much more aware of the enormous diversity of the American educational landscape. Just a few facts that I'd like us to keep in mind as we think about this larger topic. There are more than 18 million students currently enrolled in about 4,000 universities and colleges. About half of that population is in community colleges. About 80% are in public institutions. Most American undergraduates are over the age of 22. They are attending part-time. Many have jobs. Many have families. I used to tell our students at Bryn Mawr that the number of students who attend full-time a selective residential liberal arts college in this country could fit into a Big Ten football stadium, all of them combined. That although that's the model you see in the movies, whether it's Hollywood or Bollywood, that's where they focus attention on the college experience, it's very far from being the actual American college experience right now. The faculty job market has changed dramatically, as we all know. Tenure and tenure-track jobs currently constitute only about 25% of faculty positions at American colleges and universities. The humanities job market is sinking. Catherine is very, very well aware of this as she plans and thinks about this program. I noted a report from the American Historical Association that indicated that a high of 1,064 tenure-track tenure line job openings in 2006, 2007, which last year was 638. So that's a pretty precipitous drop, even acknowledging the ups and downs. A recent report from the Council on Graduate Studies, one that admittedly covers the humanities, the social sciences, and the sciences, said that about 1/2 of PhD holders find their first jobs in non-academic sectors, whether that's nonprofits or the government, government agencies, corporations, or startups. Simultaneously, the higher education marketplace itself is morphing. Just, I continue to read the Inside Higher Ed and the Chronicle of Higher Ed every day, and within the last couple of weeks, MIT announced a new MA program in which half of the courses for the students will be done as MOOCs, as online courses. And those students who do well enough and who place through a proctored exam, who indicate their ability to continue, only that group will then have an on-campus experience. It's a way of, in a sense, doing that try it before you buy it form of education, which I think, given the costs we are encountering in higher education, will become ever more common. Arizona State has started this thing called Global Freshman Academy. Again, online, partnership with edX, where students do work online, then take proctored examinations, if they choose to, which they can then apply for Arizona State credit, and it's transferable credit to other institutions. So you could dip your toe in the water. You could start and take some of these courses and get a sense of whether you are college ready in a more hands-on way than has previously been the case. Then there's the whole world of competency. I always have trouble with that word, competency-based programs, which are sprouting up everywhere, which really decouple the classroom from the credit hour. Some of these have been approved by the U.S. Department of Education for federal financial aid. And it shifts the whole focus from time spent to learning achieved. And then finally, there's the globalization of American higher education, which is proceeding at an ever-increasing pace. Both the notion of the branch campuses or the programs abroad that American institutions are creating, but also the much greater flow of international traffic into American universities and colleges, particularly at the undergraduate level, a lot of which started after 2009 and continues to build. That's the placement. That's the place we are working in, or we are operating in as we engage these conversations. I want to point to a couple of programs that have emerged that are helpful in making that move of or shifting the focus from just a classroom-based career path for PhDs to a broader focus. One that's been around for quite a while is CLEAR's postdoctoral fellowship. The Council on Learning and Informational Resources has had a program for a number of years. I know about it particularly because they would do their summer intensive trainings on the Bryn Mawr campus. And this took recent PhDs who had an interest in being placed in major university libraries and started to build for them the skills to do that kind of work. And they would have placements of between 2 and 3 years in those academic libraries, and many of them have continued in that field. I know many of you, I think, are probably aware of the American Council of Learned Societies Public Fellows program, which does a similar thing. It recruits recent PhDs and places them in nonprofits, in government agencies. ACLS pays the stipend. I'm going to investigate this for the Library of Congress to see if it's possible to become one of the sponsoring organizations for these placements, again, an effort to broaden the scope of professional preparation for recent PhDs. And I'm sure we're going to hear from Katja about NEH's announcement just this week of the Next Generation grants and their grants to faculty collaboratives to help transform doctoral level education by working with institutions in a variety of ways.
Wait, we have a new grant? I didn't know about it.
Not to steal your thunder, but I thought it was so exciting that the word on that came out in this very week that you are planning.
Do not think
this.
it was not planned,
Oh.
my dear.
Good, wonderful. Just a few ideas to throw into the hopper then as I conclude these remarks. You know, when I sat down with the students or the junior fellows at the Kluge Center, we talked a little bit about to what extent do graduate students have an awareness of the larger higher education marketplace, and how do they get it if they had it? And it was interesting to hear, well, they get it in the hallway, or they get it kind of by osmosis. There isn't any way in which they get it directly from faculty. And I think it is important to make that a more deliberate part of the learning process for PhD students, whether it's done directly by programs or offering students opportunities to get it. They also mentioned that there was a big knowledge gap between the awareness that younger faculty have of that larger landscape, that larger marketplace, and that which older faculty have. The older faculty have not felt the need to be as clued in, I think, to the changes that are moving so quickly in American higher education. A second thing, and this is not novel, this is not new, but it's not given enough attention, which is if graduate students could be given opportunities to talk about the skills that they are developing during their graduate education, as much as they're given opportunities to talk about the learning that they are achieving. Because in fact, they are developing an extraordinary toolbox and an extraordinary skill set. I just started to jot down things like research virtuosity. You learn how to take a topic and move quickly to find, good information about it. Penetrating and persuasive writing, compelling public presentations, peer leadership and collaboration, which is a hugely important thing if you go into a corporation or a nonprofit, is being able to pull groups together to collaborate. But the service work that so many graduate students do gives you training in precisely that. Language fluency. Peter, I'm winking at you as I say this, but it's so important. And for many graduate programs and graduate students, considerable international exposure and experience. Of course, there's the whole world of the digital humanities and the technology skills that students pick up in that. The interpersonal skills. I learned a lot just learning to deal with a kind of difficult supervisor. But it is a skill, and you do pick it up. Project management. Managing the production of a PhD is a major project, but we don't often talk about it in those terms. So if rather than just absorbing these skills, students learned how to, in a sense, brag about the skill set that they've acquired, I think it would be an asset to their time in the PhD. I'd also urge PhD students to think about the emerging future in higher education, to think about what I know is emerging in terms of what I would call the entrepreneurial professor. There are people who are going to sell their services online in ways that make them kind of rock stars in the fast evolving world of online education. As especially undergraduate education starts to become more disaggregated and people put together degrees from different sets of experiences, some residential, some non-residential, some in other countries, some here, some competency-based, others classroom time. All of that's going to open possibilities for some young faculty to really excel in their ability to be compelling and engaging teachers to large audiences via these new technologies. I would say start networking from the time you begin a graduate program. Don't just network with faculty. Network as broadly as you possibly can. Imagine a world in which even if you do get a tenure track position, you are going to be wanting to be more of a public spokesperson for the humanities, as Catherine has said, and to be more knowledgeable about government, about the nonprofit sector, about the private sector. So anytime you can get an informational interview with somebody, it's time well spent. And starting sooner rather than later helps to build that whole network upon which you can draw in the future. And finally, I would say, let's keep working on the elephant in the room, which I would call the poisonous academic culture that insists that anything but a tenure-track job at a major research university is a distant second best. I'll give the final word to two eminent historians, Anthony Grafton and Jim Grossman. In a recent report, they stated, a first step towards adjusting graduate education to occupational realities would be to change our attitudes and our language, to make clear to students entering programs in history that we are offering them education that we believe in, not just as reproductions of ourselves, but also as contributors to public culture and even the private sector. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chair. That was very thoughtful. I'm going to start in a slightly polemical way, talking about graduate and professional schools, or graduate and professional education, as administrators at least call it. We think we know what a professional school does. It prepares you to exercise a profession. It's kind of high-level vocational training. Maybe. I'll come back to that. Graduate education seems to me is a more slippery beast. As it's developed over the span of time since Daniel Coit Gilman more or less invented it at Johns Hopkins, it's come to be largely a professional school also, essentially training professors for university physicians. Gilman's importation of a German model of advanced research seminars and doctoral theses dedicated to an original contribution to knowledge was, I think, at the time, a very necessary addition to a still somewhat provincial American university. It was a reform that also had analogs in other countries. For instance, in France, following defeat in the Franco-Prussian War, it was considered imperative to imitate the German model of advanced research, especially in fields such as history, since it seemed to have contributed to the Prussian invincible dominance. Now, I don't want to, and I'm not really competent to either, rehearse the history of the PhD in this country or the attempts to break its hegemony, such as President Lowell's institution of the Society of Fellows at Harvard, all attempts that never really succeeded. I'm more interested in asking what we think the PhD has come to mean and whether that meaning can be opened up to the concerns that animate Catherine Temple's Connected Academics program that brings us here today. I'd like to reach for an analogy to law school that may or may not be pertinent. Law school seems preeminently a professional school. After the award of the JD, most of its graduates seek accreditation through sitting for the bar exam in one of the several states. Yet, of course, many law schools, including Georgetown's, have traditionally seen themselves as something much more than vocational schools. They've wanted to offer training in a body of material and a kind of reasoning considered useful in a number of social enterprises. And throughout American history, of course, the lawyer has been potentially a community leader and a representative in various political and civic bodies. And most of our leading law schools offer a curriculum that takes the student into high jurisprudential theory, into dialogue with philosophy, and more recently, economics. The well-publicized crisis in the job market for lawyers, partly the result of outsourcing a good deal of routine legal work to companies in India and elsewhere, has led to proposals, including from President Obama, that law school become more resolutely vocational, that it cut back from 3 to 2 years, thus reducing tuition debt on the part of its graduates and giving an education more focused on the available jobs. And inevitably, this has led to pushback, especially from the so-called elite law schools that don't want to become mere trade schools. And the crisis of legal education, I think, could lead in a different direction from focus on the vocational. It could open onto a more creative engagement of law in relation to other cultural discourses and a broader study of the place of law in American social and even psychic life. not clear at this point what the outcome's going to be. Now, I'm not sure that I've suggested a usable analogy here to PhD programs, which for a long time have faced wretched job markets, but seem to have responded mainly by paralysis. In the case of the university where I now teach, the dominant model which dictates we should speed students to a doctorate in 5 years so as to get them most efficiently on the job market seems to me to have been forged in 1950s Detroit. Roll them off the assembly line as fast as you can, and it bears very little relation to current conditions, which would seem to dictate a more leisurely extended apprenticeship for a few students who might in fact be able to find an academic position. But the leadership of graduate education in arts and sciences, in my own experience in a few universities, has long seemed to me to be especially obtuse. Graduate education has had much less sustained attention and much less reform than undergraduate education. I think it's time that that changed. Now, if graduate education in the liberal arts were to follow the model now proposed by many for law schools, that is, cut back and become more resolutely vocational, what would that mean? Perhaps something like the junior research fellowships practiced in the UK, taking a few of the best and nursing them for some time while waiting for an academic job opening. But of course, that's on the assumption that graduate school is primarily a professional school that's tied to employment in higher education. That's what it's been for a long time. It was that already when I was a graduate student in the 1960s. I remember the sinking feeling of narrowing horizons when I moved from undergraduate to graduate student, a sense of being enlisted in a profession before I was really ready for that, while I still wanted to be intellectually exploratory. And I think graduate school very often discourages exploration and experimentation. They're, of course, inefficient, they waste time. Graduate education has tied itself so closely to the production of the PhD, headed for positions in the university. And of course, those positions no longer exist in any quantity. For me, then, what's at stake here in the questions that Catherine has posed go or could go to the heart of the matter. Are we content with the current definition of graduate education, or ought we to undertake a thorough overhaul on the premise that the production of teachers for higher education is only one of the things that graduate school is for? I think it's clear that I'm in favor of that latter alternative. Graduate education should not seek to reproduce professors like myself. It's hard to give up the reproduction model. It's cozy to have students who want to do the kind of things you love to do, but the profession itself has changed radically in ways that we're all aware of. And that means that even those who land a university job will most often have a very different experience of academia than my generation did. The cultural wills that lie outside academia have changed too, and they need to be brought into the dialogue. They may not always know this, but the kind of disinterested thought and debate that characterize PhD students at their best could make a positive difference in a number of public cultural institutions. So a path to the reform of graduate education, I think, might begin by decoupling it from preparation for the profession. I'm not against competence, scholarship, specialization. Those remain crucial in my mind. And I hope some few students will continue to want to be professors. But the definition of graduate studies should cease to be so rigidly departmental as it is. I think the graduate student should be freed to undertake a much broader interdisciplinary course of study, one that provides more and richer context for understanding the place of any one discipline within the academy and within the world. For instance, no one, whether studying German literature or Malaysian anthropology, should be ignorant of the workings of the global economy. A course in economics ought to be part of everyone's baggage at the graduate level. Also, a course, it seems to be, in constitutional law, and at least an acquaintanceship with computer science. And you can complete the list in many ways. There's nothing wrong with training cultural generalists, and that is part of the mindset that has to change. I want to see our students in the liberal arts feel empowered. And so just a few words about what I think that empowerment might consist of. I see it coming from a student's growing mastery of a range of discourses that really do constitute the realities we all have to negotiate. There, in fact, lies the particular strength of training in the humanities, particularly in what I would call the interpretive humanities, including English, foreign language, literatures, philosophy, art history, archaeology, anthropology, for instance, where we're called upon to read texts and objects, artifacts, to interpret them to our audiences, to make them speak afresh. In the classroom, we humanists are very often ventriloquists, it seems to me, speaking not so much in our own voices as making another voice, a voice from the past, for instance, or from another culture, or the voice implicit in a mute object, speak through ourselves. We undertake this strange and very exhilarating experience of self-alienation as we subordinate ourselves to other cultural expressions. We practice something like Keats's notion of negative capability, submerging our own personality into what we would bring to our students' appreciation. All great art is impersonal, T.S. Eliot taught us, by which he meant that it transcends the individual personality, and we as teachers try to reach that ideal. And I think we humanists are better equipped than most others in the university to understand the import, the meaning, and the weight of discourses of all sorts, and to make our students see how learning to understand, to decode, if you will, these discourses, their possibly hidden intentions as well as their overt statements, gives them the power to negotiate the world. What it all comes back to, I think, in the final analysis, is reading. Reading in the sense of a close, considered, self-aware activity, what is sometimes referred to as close reading, or even better, I think, slow reading. Reading, in my sense of the term, includes close attention to foreign languages as well as our own. It's reading as a very aware activity is what we learn to do better than anyone else, and I think it's what we have to offer other disciplines and to the wider world. As was mentioned a moment ago in the introduction, for the past few years I've been teaching a seminar I call The Ethics of Reading. And by that I don't intend to suggest that reading certain great books will make you a more moral person. I don't believe that's necessarily the case. I think it's rather that reading closely, attentively, with a questioning regard for the uses of language and nuances of meaning is in itself an ethical enterprise. I undertook to teach the course first in reaction to reading the torture memos when they began to be released by the Department of Justice a number of years ago. Those memos, which you remember, were composed in the Office of Legal Counsel at Justice, the very inner sanctum of legal interpretation, offered such abusive uses of interpretation, such twisted, distorted readings and uses of language, that I said to myself that anyone trained in literary interpretation would just say, no, this won't do. You can't make texts. In this case, the United States Code is incorporating the Convention Against Torture and Cruel and Inhuman Treatment. You can't make it mean whatever you want it to mean, just to serve the interests of your political masters. There are interpretive moves that are not simply wrong, but also unethical, and that will have horrible results in the real world. We humanists may not be in a position to stop torture from occurring, but at least we can expose the language, the speech acts, in which it is made to seem a legitimate tool of national policy. What I'm trying to urge, then, is the very centrality of our task to everything in the real world. In fact, I hate the opposition forced upon us between academia and the real world. What could be realer than learning to read in all stages of that skill, from the very first apprenticeship in language to the attempt to understand the most difficult texts and ideas? Cognitive psychologists confirm our sense that without reading in its most intense and extensive senses, there can't be any mastery of the world. and also no resistance to those who would master others through the manipulation of language and message. If I'm right, it follows that it shouldn't be impossible, it shouldn't even be difficult to connect academics to that world outside. Each world needs the other. But of course, neither one quite knows that yet. The world of cultural work and commentary outside the academy, very much including journalism about intellectual matters, often seems hostile to academics content with a caricature of what we're like. If graduate education needs to change, so do the organizations that might be interested in smart and well-trained students. And here for me lies the deep interest of the experiment that Catherine Temple and the Georgetown English Department are launching to make both the Academy and other institutions of cultural commentary and transmission understand how they need one another. We need to find ways for them to read together in a mutual exchange of understandings.
There's no way I should be sitting at a table with these guys. Y'all are really smart. And wow. Yeah, so when Catherine called me actually, and said, "Can you come speak at this panel?" I said, "Are you sure you're the right person?" It's true I have a PhD in English. It's also true that I don't use it on a day-to-day basis, except for the fact that I do every single day and every single thing that I do. And I didn't know that that was what was going to happen. And I would never trade those 3 years that I spent making $16,000 for anything in the world, because that's the benefit of Eastern Washington. You can live on $16,000 a year, and that's why I chose that school. I had a career in software engineering in Silicon Valley for about 15 years before I decided that I wanted to do something else. And I didn't know what that something else was. And I knew that I needed to figure it out. And I knew that I was good at reading and writing, and I thought rhetoric was pretty cool. So I said, I'm going to take some time and go learn a new field. I'm going to go become a subject matter expert in higher education and graduate education, because I knew what I was good at, which is building software. I don't know if you experienced software in educational settings, but it sucks. Still does. And I knew that I could fix it, but I knew that nobody was going to listen to me without the ethos and the experience in higher ed to do it. So I went and got that. And again, I wouldn't trade it for the world. Being a teacher made me a better manager. I manage 11 people, and they're all software engineers. And what does that have to do with being a PhD in English? Nothing, except I'm really good at herding cats because I taught freshmen. And the end, right? How do you lead without being a dictator? How do you lead without being a tyrant? How do you, the sage on the stage versus the guide on the side? And I learned how to do that only in my graduate education in English. And I think that that's really important. I think that, what you were saying about the things that we don't value, or it appears that we don't value in graduate education, are all of these skills that make us really good at our jobs. We're good communicators, we're good collaborators, we're good, well, theoretically, right? We're good communicators, we're good collaborators, we're good teachers, we're good mentors, we're good coaches, we are good critical thinkers, all the things that, you get a humanities degree because you're, not just because you can be fun at parties, but because you can conceptualize the whole, right, and tell a story about what's going on. And I tell a story about what's going on every single day when I'm trying to convince other teams to work with us to build something in a certain way, or I'm trying to get more money for something. It has nothing to do with English, but it's everything to do with rhetoric. And those are really important skills, and we learn them all in our graduate education, and they are the things that don't count. Every service counts for what, 10% on your tenure file, 20% maybe if you're lucky. It's what you do all the time, and it's what makes you, outside of the academy, should you ever decide to go outside the academy and try to get a job, it's those intangibles. Those are the things that set you apart from everybody else. I just hired 2 new software engineers, 2 new grads, and they're software engineers. Like, okay, well, you know how to code. Super. Except that I hired the 2 guys that wrote a really awesome cover letter, because they were able, out of the 150 applicants that I got for that new grad position, they were able to explain through their resume why they were good at what they did. Because every single other resume looked exactly the same, because they were all graduating from the same schools at the same time with the same projects. But the people that were able to explain what they can do and why and tell that story are the people that I hired. And for no other reason than that. And those are skills that are important, and those are skills that we teach our undergrads, so why aren't they skills that we teach our graduate students? How to be a part of the workforce writ large, not just the workforce in the academy, because those are 2 really different things, right? Those things that we don't value are the things that we should be valuing. And then there's your provocative statement of vagueness and grand sweeping generalizations that would get you a C on an essay. But it's what I'm saying is, like, those things are the things that make you different. They're the things that make you valuable. They're the things that you can latch onto and build, and they don't come from reading Emerson, even though I read a lot of Emerson. Wrote a dissertation on Emerson. That doesn't make me a better manager, doesn't make me a better architect of software, but it makes me a better communicator. So I can walk into my CTO and say, our company wants to build a platform to help teachers help students get to the next level, which is incidentally what we build. And he can say, who are you? You're just that chucklehead that sits downstairs. I'm like, well, when I was a teacher, when I sat here, when I was doing this, this was the experience that I had. This is what I knew that people needed. This was the pain point. You're all subject matter experts in a lot of things, and lots of those things are valuable outside of the academy. And every day is a learning moment, is a teaching moment. As advisors for graduate students, please remind them that every day you're learning something, and every day you're trying to connect a dot, and every day makes you a subject, a little bit better at mastering one or many subjects. And all of those can get you down the path of anything. You can go anywhere and do anything. I mean, that's the silly thing that we say to, undergrads when we're trying to, keep all the funding for our departments, is that, it's valuable to be a liberal arts major because, you're a critical thinker and all of this, and it's great, but it's actually true, right? Like, all of those skills are really valuable, and they are exactly the things that set you apart. So, if I were to say, what's the number one thing I wish I had as a graduate student that I didn't get, it's nothing. I had an amazing graduate school experience because I managed to go to a school that said, you're not at Harvard. You're at Washington State University. You're 8 miles from Idaho. Good luck getting a tenure track job from this school, except for the fact that every single person for the 2 previous years from my PhD program got a tenure track job because they were really good teachers, and they were really good presenters, and they were really good collaborators, and they were really good thinkers, because somehow that department just decided that those were things that they valued. And it wasn't official, and it wasn't funded. It was just, this is just what happened. And they're really valuable candidates. And I lucked into it, and I thought it was great that I got to go there. And I wish that every other person that I know that went to graduate school, and I know plenty of them, all of my friends are failed academics. It's true. It's so true. They didn't have a great experience. They didn't have a chair saying, by the way, this plan that you're putting together for your dissertation, it follows these tenets of project management that actually the rest of the world uses too. Oh, I can use that skill later on in life. Connecting those dots and sort of showing how it's all the same. Like outside of academia, inside of academia, processes are the same. There's nothing special about being in academia besides it's harder because you got to fight more, quite frankly. But there's nothing special about being an academic versus a chucklehead like me on the street that sits in an office from 9 to 5 and makes stuff. We're all using our brains. We're all using, our great humanistic skills. And I would just say, we need to remember that and tell our students that. Graduate directors, help make those connections. Help coach your faculty to coach their advisees that, everything that they're doing in their academic education is transferable, relatable, etc. We're selling them that bill of goods, right? That's what liberal arts is. It's relatable. You can, you learn everything about the world and tell a story and take a holistic view and all of those things that are great, but then we don't value the ability to do that, or we're not focusing on the ability to do that, or we don't offer people the ability to practice that. And so I would just say, again, with zero ethos in this field, I mean, I am not these folks, right? I'm just a software engineering manager that happened to write a PhD dissertation on Emerson. And again, wouldn't trade it for the world. And I'm really good at what I do because I have a PhD in English, but nobody that I work with knows I do have one. Because they're like, what? What? That wasn't what got me a job. But using my skills that I learned, that I honed, got me that job. It got me all of my jobs, actually. And I'm very, very grateful for that. Go Rhetoric. Gotcha? Yeah.
My name is Katya, and I'm a recovering academic.
Hi, Katya.
Thank you. I say that flippantly, but I also don't, because it's a genetic matter with me. So my parents were both professors, and I very consciously, at some point, decided that wasn't the life for me. Although I had a wonderful childhood in blessed Northampton, Massachusetts, so you can figure out where they might have been professors. And but I was surrounded by cultural experiences. But I think that I understood that culture exists in the world, not just in the university. So I kind of want to bring in the theme of where is humanities in the world and where is humanities in the university. So my mother is not from an academic family. She's from a medical family. And her mother, my grandmother, was a collector of many, many, many different things. But she had a penchant for little porcelain creamers. So when we went to visit her, she had her creamer collection in a little cupboard. And she could tell me where she purchased or who gave her each one of the creamers, with the story behind either the creamer itself or what the person had told her. And I loved talking to her. It was also a way for me to relate to my grandmother. And my mother had not that much time for the creamers, but I love the creamers, but it skips a generation, like many things. Another experience that kind of formed me was a babysitter who was a student at the college where my parents were teaching, and she was actually an art major, a studio art major, and she later became an art educator. But in the summers, to finance her education, she was from Eastern Massachusetts. She was a Lowell Mill girl. So she put on the costume of the mill girl and was taking people on a kind of living history tour throughout the locks in Lowell. And in December in Northampton, she would stand in my living room and in her very heavily accented East Massachusetts accent tell me the story of the mill girls. And so I came to understand that history, which is eventually what I decided that I really loved. My parents were both in languages, so I spent some of my Christmas vacations at the MLA where they were, sitting up in bed saying, "Oh my gosh, let's go to this session on the second vowel shift." And I was like, oh my God. So so I learned that history exists in the world outside, that people participate in history in many different ways that make them money, that help them with their studies, that bring them a huge amount of happiness in the world through creamers, that connect them with generations. And so this was kind of how I understood what an education should be. I very early, I think after those two experiences, I loved Sturbridge Village. I realize now that that's probably really not a great thing, because Sturbridge Village is great but also problematic in many ways. But I loved watching people make bread the old-fashioned way, and I loved all kinds of experiences that were a window onto something other than today, whether it was through books or through actions or through stories. And so I started working for museums, and I thought that this was one of the ways in which you could be a historian or work with the past, but yet be a part of the world. And that's kind of been where I've been in a variety of different places throughout my life. And one of the things that I want to talk about today is how your personal journey coincides with graduate school, because I think we kind of forget about that. So I want to do a little poll. How many of you are currently graduate students? Okay. And how many of you are former graduate students? Should be all the rest of you, right? Almost all of the rest. So former graduate students, please keep your hands up. How many of you knew when you were graduate students where you would be today? Okay, and how many of you took a path that you did not expect? Now you can raise your hands, those who didn't. Okay. So I think that this is something that we haven't really acknowledged fully in the academy yet. That we don't know at the outset of graduate school where we might be going. I mean, maybe it's, oh, I thought I would be at Yale, but I ended up at Princeton. That's, okay. Ooh. Or the other way around. But I mean, most people, I think, don't have a kind of Cassandra or positive Cassandra-like notion of what's going to happen to them when they start graduate school. In fact, many of the people have no conception of what's going to happen to them. And I think often students who start graduate school relatively early, I mean, a lot of people, even though most undergraduates in this country, according to your statistics, are older than 21, a lot of graduate students are in that 22 to 24 category when they start. And they are starting because someone told them, you're really smart, you should go to graduate school. And I'm not sure that's the reason to go to graduate school, because that connects to this kind of reproduction model that you're talking about. So I'm trained as a German historian, so of course I had a Doktorvater, which is a doctor father, which is a very reproduction-oriented rhetorical device. And 8 weeks ago, I myself reproduced for the first time. I have twins at home, 8 weeks old. And I really understand that an academic reproduction and a reproduction in other ways are very different things, and we shouldn't be confusing them as we are all the time. You know, you talk about academic lineages, you talk about academic genealogies, and you're trying as a student to kind of fit into this family tree model where you might not fit, and maybe you won't end up fitting where you thought you would fit when you started. And so one of the things that I think is really important to remember is when you start graduate school, you have to emancipate yourself. Emancipate yourself from these reproductive notions. Emancipate yourself as an adult. Because in this country, undergraduate training is an infantilizing experience. I mean, You get somebody making food for you in a dining hall if you're in a residential college, or if you're not, then maybe you live at home and your mom or your dad or your sister or whoever else is also making food. I mean, it's not totally emancipatory, and graduate school kind of continues this trend, and people feel cowed to do what they might want to do or don't even know what they want to do. So that was not my experience. I took 2 years off between undergrad and graduate school, and I was in Germany, and I was living my own, and I learned how to fold fitted sheets from a Polish woman in a laundromat, and that was great. We didn't speak a language besides laundry. I love laundry, so if you want to know how to do that, I know.
I do kind of want to know.
Yeah, I'll tell you later. So I went back to graduate school knowing that I didn't want to be an academic because of my background and my parents. They had a great experience, by the way. It wasn't traumatizing at all, but this was kind of my rebellion, such as it is. I mean, that's kind of ridiculous, but that was my rebellion. So I did a lot of things on the side. And I didn't tell a lot of people what I was doing on the side because I knew that people wouldn't be excited about me doing all of these things on the side. But not a lot of my other graduate student colleagues did those things, nor were they encouraged to, nor did they talk about them. And so I think that is how I was formed as a historian and also as a humanist in graduate school. And I got the ticket and put the ticket on the table, and then I went into a totally different amusement park. And that's a kind of preamble to what happened this week, which was that another product that I helped to create came into the world this week, which is the Next Generation Humanities PhD program. And I don't know, have you heard of it?
Probably not everybody.
So the National Endowment for the Humanities is the federal agency that's tasked with giving money to the humanities. If you don't know who the National Endowment for the Humanities is, please look it up. NEH.gov. We have money. Well, it's actually your money if you're a taxpayer. You can give yourself money to do a variety of different things, and there are all kinds of different divisions and offices that give money. I'm the head of the Challenge Grant Program, and I started at the NEH at the end of January this year, and I tasked myself and was tasked by the chairman to revivify challenge grants in specific ways. And challenge grants had been a category which was about matching monies. So 1-to-1, 3-to-1, 2-to-1. We give you 1, you raise 2, you raise 3, you raise 5, you raise 25-to-1. And I thought it was time to make the challenge about the humanities rather than the money. The money can always be the challenge, but what are the challenges facing the humanities? And so one of the major challenges, I think, is to graduate education. So I spent the last half of the year trying to figure out how we can really make changes instead of thinking about making changes. So there's been, over the last 10 years, a lot of studies that have counted the number of humanities PhDs who are not in the academy, tried to do analyses of where the market is, etc. And very few kind of toes in the water of actual change. How do you create cultural change within humanities organizations, mostly in universities with PhD programs? And so this week we launched 2 new grant programs. One is called the Next Generation Humanities PhD Planning Grant, and the other is Implementation Grant, which are offering institutions that have graduate programs in the humanities the opportunity to come together to create that kind of cultural change in a way that makes sense for that institution. The hope is that it will be a kind of cross-program, multidisciplinary, maybe even multi-school connection about how to reimagine along the lines that you both were talking about and you've experienced in your life in Eastern Washington. Great place. I was in Idaho this year.
Right, there you go.
Awesome. And to figure out what a new form might look like. This means, will there be changes to graduate student curriculum? Will there be changes to the format dissertation? Will there be changes in how people recruit students? Will there be changes to the role of the tenured professor? Will there be changes to all kinds of different things that we kind of take for granted in graduate programs? But the onus is on the institution to figure that out for itself. And that's why we did the planning grant, so that people can come together and talk about this and make a plan that makes sense for that institution, because each institution is going to be different. And the implementation grant is for people who have had those conversations already and want big bucks relatively. I mean, it's not Silicon Valley bucks, but
big.
it's okay. It's $350,000 over 3 years to be matched 1-to-1. So to make those changes and actually get going. So that came out this week, and the deadline is February 17th. And my 2 colleagues in Challenge and I, we're a very small department, will be talking to all kinds of different organizations that want to apply for these grants over the course of the fall and then the early winter. We're doing a webinar, although we're not sure exactly what that format is going to be and how we can get multiple voices rather than just little blips on the right side of the screen, on December 3rd. And then we'll be accepting draft applications throughout, I would say, December and early January. So let me stop there, because I'm sure you have questions about that, but I don't want to talk too much about things that you don't want to hear about. Thanks.